Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Tim Mather. I'm joined here by my colleague Subra Kumaraswamy. Thank you for joining our webcast here today on API security for DevOps and InfoSec. Just a couple of quick administrative announcements before we get started here. First of all, we do want your questions, please. We're going to take questions at the end, so please feel free to use the dialog box in your WebEx there, and we look forward to your questions at the end. The slides and the video will be available online. The video will be posted on YouTube on the Apigee channel there, and the slides will be posted online afterwards as well on SlideShare. So again, slides and video will be available. Let me take a second here, say hello, Subra, and introduce yourself if you would, please.
Hello, folks. I am Subra Kumaraswamy. I'm the Chief Security Architect for Apigee and Product Manager for Security Features. A little bit about myself. I spent the first half of my career doing software programming and engineering work, and then the second half securing it. Most recently, as folks have been following in the industry, quite a bit of a mobile-first and cloud-first type architecture going on, but really the API first is going to be the glue for those. So today we'll be talking about some of the journey that customers are taking and how we can help you to be safe.
Okay, great, Subra. And again, my name is Tim Mather. I'm the Chief Security Officer here at Apigee, and I've been doing information security my entire career. Actually, Subra and I co-authored a book previously, and now we get to work together, so
right.
We're having a good time here. All right, so let's jump in. Here's the agenda for what we'd like to cover with you today. We're going to start off with the security architecture framework. Then Subra is going to dive into DevOps and what that means in the context of API security. And then I'm going to do the same thing with regards to information security in the context of API. Subra is then going to detail a little bit about threat protection, what you should be concerned about when you're trying to protect your APIs. And then security analytics, I'm going to talk briefly about that on some of the analytics out of your API platform that you should be hopefully utilizing to your benefit. And then, of course, again, we want to get to your questions at the end, so please make sure that you do ask them. We look forward to your questions at the end. Before we jump in here, let's talk a little bit about what the goals are that we'd like to accomplish when it comes to APIs. So first of all, we'd like to have end-to-end security, that is, and we'd like to manage that through configuration.
That includes encryption too.
That includes encryption, that's right. But really what we're concerned about is that end-to-end aspect all the way from that application, whether it's a mobile or web application, all the way to the back-end systems that IT is responsible for. We, of course, when it comes to security, we'd like to make sure that we've got both prevention and detection off of that. Prevention doesn't always work, as we know all too well, so we'd at least like to be able to detect that, and we'd like to have that integrated into our architecture to help us limit what the attack surface is. We, of course, would like to be able to do all of this with flexibility, and that includes the flexibility to integrate with existing security services that you may have, whether they're internal or whether they're external. And finally, of course, we want to make sure that we're doing this from an app-centric and API perspective so that we're really getting that threat protection off of that. So those are the goals, and that's what the context, if you will, that we're going to be discussing our agenda in today. So that said, let's jump into the architecture, and Subra, why don't you drill down with us and begin this, and let's talk about this. And actually, we should say that really one of the things that we want to open with here is to differentiate, and we're going to, of course, explain this, differentiate between consumption and exposure and what that means and why it's so important to ensure that security is applied to both sides of those equations. So, Subra, why don't you...
Yes, great. So let me start with on architecture. And first and foremost, I know there are quite a few folks with different background, but by setting up the architecture context, you'll be able to, as we go through the entire flow here, we can relate to this. So Tim mentioned briefly about looking at API architecture from a consumption exposure perspective. So let me start with what we mean by that. Some folks coming from DevOps, perhaps you're familiar with the term southbound, or outbound, and then we have inbound and northbound, right? So the northbound is what we're calling as consumption tier. Those are coming in from your applications to your backend, right? So these are usually accessed through a REST API or a SOAP API. So that's what we're calling consumption. Exposure, on the other hand, is really the backend API. This is your business logic, your applications, your sometimes SOA infrastructure, These are exposing API to the application they are consuming it. So now, why? You may ask, why do you have to look at it this way, right? And as an architect, as an architect, I would like to see separation of concerns first and foremost. So we want to make sure that we can separate those two concerns here, and the intermediate tier, as you see here, API tier, is the tier that is helping mediate that between consumption and exposure. Also, the other separation of concerns, that we'll address here is specifically the security considerations that you have to think about from the consumption perspective, i.e. the apps, is going to be very different from the exposure tier. For example, if you look at the mobile developers or your partners who are writing applications on your platform, the security considerations there are very specific to how do you secure the authentication, the data perhaps at rest on the endpoints, and in most cases authorization, right? It has to be flexible enough, right? I want to emphasize the word flexible. The consumption tier is all about keep making sure that we can have flexible mechanism for each of those applications. At the same time, we want to make sure it's consistent for the backend. We don't want the backend applications to do different type of authentications based on the type of application. We want the backend to authenticate the exact same way, through LDAPs, through SAML, and so forth. So this is the kind of the high level, overview in terms of why, as you're approaching your API first architecture, you have to think about this from a consumption tier, understand the security model, the requirements, and also be able to look at from the exposure side where your API architects, your DevOps and your IT security architects are looking at it in terms of making sure it is consistent.
And again, just to repeat what Subra said there, but when you hear consumption, think northbound. When you hear exposure, think southbound off of that. And we should also point out, Subra, that this is not SOA. This is very different. SOA is primarily point-to-point integration of applications, and really what we're talking about here is point to multi-point, which is what makes API so powerful. And just one other point on this slide then, Subra, is that when you talk about flexibility and the importance of flexibility, when it comes to scaling your apps, that's where the flexibility becomes extremely important.
Exactly. Some of the architects probably are familiar with the term loosely coupled architecture, which is the common pattern for any of the API first architecture. So it's very important that separation of concerns will help you do that, and you can address the security considerations for the consumption much differently from the exposure guys.
So let's talk about this in just a slightly larger context here, Subra, around security.
So now, how does it? Let's the previous slide. We talked about kind of the topologies of how we can the apps connect to the backend API. Here, let's talk about the architecture and how it all is coming together, right? So the three things here I want to emphasize. The first and foremost is there is going to be a separation of concerns between the runtime engine, what we're calling as API security, the green box, and the management tier. And management tiers also includes the identity tier that is used for managing your users, developers perhaps, the keys for the developers, again, and from a backend standpoint, the management users, their roles, and so forth. So, we want to make sure that the API platform that is, as you saw in the first slide around API tier, sometimes we call the API platform, has to provide separation of concerns. So you can be flexible, right? You can provide the flexibility for the consumption tier, and at the same time be able to provide consistent security for the backend. So key examples, right? So if you're a developer out there and you're writing applications for a mobile platform, you probably want some kind of authentication embedded in your application. So you're going to have keys, perhaps, and we'll talk more about some of the different type of authentication based on the type of application. And you're going to have policies that you want to enforce for the applications. And also from a backend administrator standpoint, and specifically IT side, you want a separation of duty there, right? Where you want to manage users and be able to create users only, not do anything else. I'll talk a little bit more about runtime engine a little bit later on, so I will, I'll skip that. But from end-to-end standpoint, we need to make sure that there is threat protection offered, right? This is again end-to-end from the standpoint of applications all the way to the backend. We need to make sure that the API platform offers that and has to be built into the platform. We don't want something to be bolt-on, and this is something that we take it very seriously here.
Yeah. So we'll get to runtime security in just a moment there, Subra, and some details on that, and then a little bit later in the webcast we'll get into some details around threat protection. But let's look a little bit then first, Subra. How does this actually manifest itself? Let's drill down here a little bit when it comes to, for example, you mentioned the need for granular and flexible authentication and also authorization. So let's talk a little bit about that, if you would, please.
In that previous architecture, we talked about some of the stakeholders of the architecture. The stakeholders are, you got the DevOps, who are actually folks who are in your organization writing code, deploying code, and going through an iteration, right? And then you got the developers, in this case specifically the app developers who are writing applications for the mobile platform, or maybe a fat client sitting in your partner side. And then you got a couple other folks like the InfoSec, who are really concerned about security in the back end without compromising the enterprise standards. Every company out there has their own enterprise framework they need to comply with. And of course the business owner, right? The business owner is the one who is sponsoring it and making sure that we're not taking unduly risk, and making sure that you're managing it in a way that meets the company's compliance requirements. And end users, of course, we can't forget the end users. We need to make sure the end users can be protected both from data at rest standpoint and data transit.
And hopefully there's millions of them. So
yes. So again, I want to emphasize the fact that the API platform is going to provide the separation of duties and concerns, and has to meet each of these stakeholders of the platform. And how does it manifest? It's going to manifest as perhaps, in this case, role-based access control. Mm-hmm. And role-based access control, we have to make sure it is much more fine granular.
Yep. Yes, must be. Absolutely. You really need that granularity, especially at scale. And the other thing that this side is highlighting for us, Subra, is that the need to have that granular RBAC role-based access control on both the exposure side and on the consumption side.
Exactly.
Different roles for each side.
And this is where sometimes when you talk about SOA, people don't look at that way. So here, as we're looking at API first architecture, mm-hmm. the consumption tier, is sometimes is where you need the fine granular authorization. Where, for example, you may have keys that are available for applications that are going to have different access controls. So we'll talk more about that in the coming slides. But again, we have to address this from each of these stakeholders' perspective.
Yeah. Let's drill down a little bit, Subra. Let's talk about DevOps here, specifically in security. And actually, before you get into that too deeply here, let's take just a second and define DevOps.
Yes.
Not everyone may be familiar with this.
Yeah. And DevOps is a function. Again, in Apigee we have a DevOps function, right? And almost every innovating companies out there have a DevOps function. The idea of DevOps is that you have developers, who typically write code. They develop code, they test the code, and then they end up handing over to an IT organization in a traditional waterfall model. Yeah. That's your developer, and then you probably had IT.
It's just too slow.
yeah, too slow, and you got the other side of the wall, so to speak. You're throwing your code against over the wall. And you got the IT folks catching it, running with it, and perhaps it's not working, they're coming back. So in the DevOps world, it's really taking those two functions and empowering developers. In most cases, it's developers who are actually expanding the scope beyond writing code to deploying the code, and they do it in a very fast way. They do it iteratively. The example is, Facebook or other social companies out there delivering features on almost daily, hourly basis, right? Yep. And so they can only happen, the innovation can happen faster only when you have those two functions combined and having the end-to-end experience controlled by the DevOps. And they are accountable. I was going to say, it also helps to hold those developers accountable. It's your code. Yes. You get it running. Yes, and I'm sure they're carrying a pager, which,
can't just throw it over the wall to IT.
Right. So DevOps and DevOps, they live in this world of providing that end-to-end experience. And there are sometimes you have ops folks, like system administrators, who might be interested in writing code, and they do fall in this category. But most often it's developers who have these additional responsibilities or privileges, so to speak. And
it's not just the high-tech companies. You look at some of the content companies. Netflix, for example, a prime example using DevOps there.
Exactly, and Netflix has contributed quite a bit of framework for the DevOps world, and which can be leveraged for various, from all the way from security to automation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get a little deeper here, Subra.
Yes. So what are some of the DevOps requirements, right? And as I mentioned early on, the DevOps folks out there are writing code, they are iterating the code, and they're deploying the code. without really touching the IT most of the time.
And checking the code.
and of course, validating the code is secure, right? So how do we do that? I mean, one of the first principles is that DevOps need to have everything done through API, right? The DevOps hate the fact, in fact, I hate the fact, to log into a console, right, and be able to do some click through and, wait for a few seconds. So it's all done through, automation tools, and most often you see Puppet, Chef deployed. And let's talk about what are the few areas that they need to think about, right? First and foremost,
those tools have actually helped enable DevOps. And the idea is to get the developers off the box.
Exactly. So, and it's repeatable, and it's something that scales. And so I think let's talk about the things that DevOps care about and they should care about. Authentication, authorization, data protection, and of course be able to do all this through APIs. So, an authentication standpoint, developers come in different flavors. Sometimes you have trusted developers, sometimes you have untrusted developers who are outside the company. So the authentication scheme needs to accommodate all the different type of users and be able to provide key protection and token management built into the platform. And then again, we talked about authorization, right? Authorization is a big requirement. And especially when you're looking at API, there are APIs that are going to be exposing sensitive data, and there are APIs that are going to be sensitive public data, right? So the keys are going to be, the scope of authorization is going to differ based on the type of API. And of course, let's not forget about encryption, right? And it has to be done in a way that you don't want any man in the middle and be able to decrypt it. So there are XML encryption standards. You can do that through your framework. You can let the API platform do that. But the key is to make sure that you are encrypting the data when it is sensitive. And again, be able to manage all this through a self-service. So developers can do this at their time, at their on demand, and be able to do this, continuously, iterative way.
So let's drill down a little bit then, Subra, and put this in the context of the runtime or the API service level. So
and if you're wondering, hey, okay, it's great, right? API platform, should offer this. Let's look at the gory details of how this happens in a platform. So the box in the center, the green box, that's your API platform, right? That's where the logic lives in terms of what you should do with API. On the left-hand side, you got the applications that are connecting to the API platform.
So that's our consumption side on the left.
The consumption side, and it is kind of, and of course we want to make sure that every API connects to HTTPS, which is TLS standard. And preferably, and must do for all the sensitive operations.
Even if the information isn't sensitive, there's still good reason to it, and we can come to that later. So.
Yes, definitely. I think that should be default, in my view. On the other side, again, as it's going through the API platform, there are various things that are happening. I'll talk about that in a second. And then once it goes out of the green box, it's actually going to your backend service, right? This is your...
That would be the exposure side.
Exposure side.
Yep.
And it's going to be, talking through a REST protocol or a SOAP protocol. And then again, translating that back. On the way back, the data passes through the API platform and hits the application, right?
So what I like about this slide, Subra, is it shows our two flows here. You have a request flow shown at the top, and you have a response flow at the bottom. And what's important is that our platform here is able to attach different policies to each of those two different flows for request versus response.
You read my mind on this, right? So we have, as a developer, right? Developer likes to know the nuts and bolts and understand what they can do with these flows, right? And as the packet is going through the REST protocol as an example, the developer should be able to set policies. And they said, you mentioned early on, configuration, not code.
Absolutely.
Right? Any new code is going to introduce new attack vectors and new attack surface. Be able to do this, like an example could be a rate limiting, right? Now, why do you want to rate limit? We know what happened with Snapchat. With when you have a very simple way of downloading data.
Oops. One of those two hacks against Snapchat could have easily been avoided.
Very easily, right? So an API platform should have that built-in function where you should be able to set certain limits on the API. So it could be on a per hourly basis, on a per day basis, what have you, right? And it protects you for two reasons. One is, it can protect you from hackers, who are trying to malicious intent, or it could be your developers who are testing the applications. And of course, the OAuth, OAuth is something that every mobile application nowadays, are using it. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different use cases of OAuth, and be able to again set policies on the OAuth and through the platform. And so now you wonder, why do you want to do this on the way back, right? And there are certain times where you may want to apply policies for the response flow, right? And so a quick note on why we have the node.js here. The API platform now should not simply pass through, right? API platform passes through data from the applications and from the consumption exposure, but there are certain cases where you may want to write applications and host it. You may write it, like we prefer node.js, and be able to do that without really hitting a backend. And a good example is if you're storing profile data. You can do that by going to the node.js versus going down to a backend service.
Okay, so let's drill down a little bit more into the authentication and authorization from a DevOps perspective here, Subra.
Yes, great. So we spoke in great length about the different needs of the developers, DevOps, as well as on the API architects and IT architects. And I think if any takeaway here is that first and foremost, the API platform is actually as it's mediating the APIs as it goes through the API platform. We have to it has to apply an access control, right? And the access control it includes authentication and authorization.
And auditing.
And auditing, and that's we don't want to forget the auditors out there. The authentication authorization needs for the for the consumption tier is going to vary depending on the type of business case, right? Yep. Use case, and a very simple use case could be a business to business, so where your API is exposed through the API platform to a partner. There, you probably have a trusted partner. You've gone through a vetting process. Could be a simple API key, right? For with the credential perhaps, and using OAuth 1 or OAuth 2. Now there are different flavors of OAuth v1. There's OAuth version 1 and version 2. We prefer OAuth version 2. The data is protected through TLS. There are some flavors out there using OAuth 1.0a, including Twitter. We won't go to the details here. But the idea here is that you should be able to choose the right level of authorization. In this case, we are giving an example of using two-legged OAuth, right? And this again, you don't have to think about too much security in this case.
But what we want to do is we want to provide flexibility,
right?
So the developers can meet whatever their organizational standards are, and at the same time, we want to make it easy for them to implement. They should be coding functionality, not coding authentication or authorization.
Right, and for each of these use cases, let's take the example of untrusted applications, right? So here again, when you have untrusted application, these are applications that maybe your third-party partner is actually writing an app on your API platform and putting that in App Store or Android Marketplace. And there, you could use again the OAuth v2 with a scope, and again the scope can help you to really narrow down the privileges of the applications. So you don't have to expose the whole API to the application, right? And lastly, the identity tracking. Sometimes people think, hey, if I put an API key, it's secure. And oh yes, of course, API key can be reverse engineered on the applications, and most often it's used for
simple
tracking.
Browser call can do that.
Yeah, so it's so things to keep in mind is sometimes API key is purely used for tracking, not for security. Yeah. So that's why we have other OAuth handshakes that helps you to be more secure, token technology.
Let's switch from DevOps and let's talk a little bit more about information security or InfoSec from this perspective.
Right. And Tim, I know this is something you've been thinking about and what's keeping up you at night, right? I am excited about DevOps, right? Because it really empowers the developers. It really helps them to be agile, innovate every day. But if you're as a CSO of organization and you're, hey, what am I putting this at stake here?
Who and what is hitting my back-end systems here? So I'm concerned
about
how
do I manage a risk, right? How do I manage a risk while I am making my developers agile?
That's right.
Can I still maintain the security of and meet other compliance and so forth?
And what are these untrusted developers doing? So as an API architect here, what I'm really concerned about is the consistency of what's available, what I can enforce when it comes to authentication and authorization. So I'm really looking for, again, it's easy for the developers, but I want to ensure that they're actually using those capabilities and that those capabilities are secure. Again, I'd rather have them reuse code that's already been developed so they can focus on functionality, and I know what the authentication mechanism is, I know how it's been implemented and secure. So I'm looking certainly for the authentication. I'm really looking for that fine-grained authorization as well of the APIs. Different calls, obviously, from an application may be going to different parts of an application, or may even be going to different systems.
Mm-hmm. So, or even third-party services.
Even third-party, and in many cases third-parties these days, especially with mashups, of course. So I'm really looking then for fine-grained authorization of what's there. So this is where that RBAC really becomes important, the flexibility to do that. I'm also looking probably for some sort of quota management too, especially if I'm trying to monetize my services off of that. So who is authorized to come in, how much, how often are they authorized to come in? So you're going to talk a little bit more about threat protection a little bit, but think here around spike arrest, rate limiting, etc., but quotas too on that. So it becomes important. And of course, really I'm looking around at the message security around all of this data that's flowing through my APIs and through these applications as well. And then from an administrator, an information security administrator, of course, I'm looking for similar types of capabilities. First and foremost, I'd like to know that my APIs are not an exception to my organizational security standards, that they actually meet my existing security standards. And I'm, of course, concerned about all this data that's flowing, this data in transit. How am I securing that? Usually done with TLS, or transport layer security. Once it hits my back-end systems, I want to ensure that it's protected there. That may involve the use of encryption, at least initially, to store that. But I certainly want to know that as this data moves along from a mobile or web application through my API management platform to my back-end, that I've got that end-to-end security off of that. And to help me do that, this is where the user and role management and the flexibility there becomes so important. You're going to talk a little bit about threat management, but I'll just say, whatever is coming into my back-end systems, I'm certainly concerned about that, not only from a confidentiality perspective in many cases, but an integrity perspective especially, and from an availability perspective, I certainly hope it doesn't take down my back-end. And then again, as you pointed out, I've got to keep the auditors happy, and from a compliance perspective, as well as probably internal audit and external audit as well. So I need to ensure that my platform is doing sufficient logging and that I can actually audit what's going on my platform.
Right. And one of the things that I hear often from customers is that they would like to see security administrators manage the users and just manage users, right? Not do anything else. Because they want to make sure that developers are, not creating their own users and, right, escalation of privilege and so forth.
And unless I've, if you will, delegated that capability out to the developers, maybe it's a trusted developer in-house, and I let them manage those users. So again, what I'm really looking for is the flexibility in those roles, my RBAC, my roles-based access control system, to provide me with that granularity on both the consumption side and on the exposure side.
And consistency to leverage your existing authentication services or other security services.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, yeah. So again, as we've been talking about here, I need to manage these users. They're in a lot of different roles. I may have sub-roles for my developers in-house, outside, trusted in, outsourced, untrusted, outsourced, etc. Don't forget about the business users.
Yes.
Business users there off of that. And so, what are my roles? What are my privileges for all of those roles? I need to manage multiple levels here.
Exactly. And so there are, having said that, right? So there are different things to think about. And as an API platform, should be offering all this in a way that it meets the DevOps and the IT architects and security architects.
Absolutely. So user provisioning. Hopefully my organization is wildly successful through its use of APIs, and I've got millions of users out there. Obviously, we've got a couple of local companies here who are in the billions of users. And so how do I provision those users? That's very important. And then once I've got them provisioned, of course, how do they fit into my RBAC? And is my RBAC actually capable of scaling to meet all of those needs? And I've got them in some sort of groups, whatever that is. And again, I may be doing this internally, but I'd like the ability to integrate with an identity provider myself, whether that's my existing system or perhaps that's through a third-party service as well.
And what I'm seeing is that a lot of the large companies, right, enterprise, Fortune 500, they may have a system in place. Sometimes it's proprietary for authentication. So the API platform should be able to integrate with that and still be able to mediate the authentication authorization with the applications.
Absolutely. Right? It's quite likely that my authentication on the consumption side is different than my authentication mechanism on the exposure side. And so I'm going to need to, if you will, translate that while ensuring that I've got that end-to-end security. Okay, and
so yes, great. So far, I mean, sounds like you've given me the comfort level, right? So we can have the cake and eat it too in some ways. We can have the developers go there, innovate, and we can have the security folks do their functions, right? All done in the single platform. And now the biggest question may come from CIO or business user or legal is, okay, guys, now can we meet the compliance? I know there are compliances out there for payment industry like PCI DSS, and you got HIPAA for healthcare, and then other compliances, privacy compliance for Europe.
Correct.
How do we do that in a way it meets that standard of the day?
Well, your point is very correct. I mean, really, I need to make sure again that my API management platform is not a carve out. I don't get a pass on the data that flows through there. So if I want to have payment data that's subject to PCI, well, I'd like to be able to use that through my API management platform. If I've got HIPAA data, of course I need to maintain, or EPHI, whatever it might be, but it's HIPAA covered, if you will. I need to ensure that my management platform is not doing anything that violates my compliance requirements. So, having end-to-end security, having that strong authentication, having that granular authorization, the ability to do encryption, not only for the data in transit, which is a given, but perhaps on the data at rest as well as it flows through. I need to ensure that I'm actually meeting my existing compliance requirements. That's where the APIs, of course, are much more beneficial to me. So no pass.
Right.
Got to do it.
And let's not forget about privacy, right?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Especially with the consent. And
Yes. We don't tend to have a lot of privacy here in the United States. The Europeans take that much more seriously, and we need to make sure, because most companies are global these days, so we need to make sure that we are giving the Europeans a comfort level when it comes to privacy and their requirements there.
Especially when you see mobile applications out there collecting location data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And
absolutely.
Now more and more of these user profile data is being gathered.
Yeah.
So the platform needs to make sure that it has the protection and be able to get the consent and manage the consent.
Absolutely. Okay, why don't we let's talk a little bit in more detail, Subra, about threat protection.
Great. So we talked about some of the basic security functions that both developers and the architects need to think about: authentication, authorization. All that is has to be in the platform level. But now there are threats, and threats, as you know, Tim, very much blended, very sophisticated, and it's very dynamic, right? And so, and developers are good at writing code, right? And they're good at
usually
writing, innovating, and now they're now I have to think about threats and what we do about the threat of the day, right? So I'll talk a little bit about the some of the threats that specific to API.
Yeah.
And then what options developers may have, right? And
in this case, let's talk about threats on the data itself.
Great. As you see in this here, there are a lot of threats. Some of the threats are not new. For example, network eavesdropping. It's been there for last for 40 years, right? Man in the middle attacks. Now, API platform is going to be in the middle between your in the consumption and the exposure, so it has the opportunity to mitigate a lot of these attacks. One of the ones I want to call out specifically here is the theft of credentials.
So what's interesting to me about this list, Subra, is a number of these, as you just said, a number of these threats are old that now still apply to my APIs, and on top of that, then we have some new threats that are really sort of API specific.
API specific, and especially given that we are empowering the developers in the DevOps framework. There are going to be areas of exposure that you got to think about, right? Here, especially as I talk about API tokens, these are tokens that are given to applications and provisioned for developers. These need to be protected the right way, right? So as you are looking at your application development framework, it has to take into consideration some of our design and take into consideration these threats. How do you secure these tokens? And I spoke briefly about different authentication techniques using OAuth. And like I said, it all is contextual. It all depends on use case. So as you're looking at the use case, you want to make sure that the tokens are protected on the endpoints, as well as on the API platform.
Yeah.
And the other aspect you mentioned data, right? Of course, everything is data. That's your currency. Data tampering. What that means is that now all the API transactions are hitting the endpoints, and you got XML, JSON payloads. It is very important that you should be able to mitigate any attacks that can happen through that.
Yep.
At the same time, be able to protect the data, right? Especially as you looked at sensitive data, for credit card data or healthcare data, those need to be protected.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about some of the examples.
Yeah, let's do. So let's drill down a little bit on some specific types of attacks that, again, from a threat protection perspective, that I worry about.
Right. So this is not the all-inclusive, right? This is some of the key ones that you're calling out here. DOS, as we talked about Snapchat, DOS could be done, in
denial of service.
Denial of service,
Yep.
It can happen either because you got a malicious actor targeting you,
Yep.
right, and sending you, a bunch of requests, and these requests looks like a legitimate API request.
Yep.
So it's not like your typical DOS where you're sending packets, and that's still possible, right? But I'm specifically talking in the context of API.
Yep.
So the DOS from API context is sending a bunch of API requests that looks like a legitimate mobile application or a legitimate application from a third party, and it can happen because someone either the hacker figured out how to steal your token.
Yep.
Right?
And that has happened, and so once that token is out in the public, then anyone can hit against your endpoint off of it.
Right. And yes, exactly.
And so this is where quotas and rate limiting becomes very important.
Very important, and the fact that you can revoke tokens.
Yep.
Right. So you should be able to say, hey, my token got leaked out. I need to go back and regenerate token.
Absolutely. And when it comes to deliberate denial of service attacks, this is where capabilities such as IP address restrictions, being able to block certain IP addresses, become important as well.
So here, I think DOS can be prevented a variety of ways, rather than mitigated. You got the IP layer protection,
Yep.
and it's almost like a defense in depth. You need to have multiple options here, starting with IP address, starting with the tokens here. And in some,
Starting with who's authenticated to make the call to begin with.
Right. And, the platform itself can figure out the spike, right, based on the spike policies,
Yep.
and be able to, throttle the connections coming in, right? So, and we also see in some cases it's not always malicious. We got sometimes
a developer makes a mistake.
Yeah.
The API goes wild.
Yeah.
Oh, oops.
Or you got someone out there in QA, bench pounding your API, right? And simply it was inadvertent,
Yeah.
and you thought, hey, we have successful API.
I didn't know that was in production yet.
Yeah, exactly. So you need mitigation against both of these type of attacks. And a little bit about the other type of attacks. As if you're a web developer out there, I'm sure you come across the top 10 WASP top 10.
Yep.
That includes your SQL SQL injection attacks, your cross-site scripting, request forgery attacks, and so forth. Now, how does it manifest in the API? It can manifest through the payload. You can have an XML injection attack or JSON injection attack. And the platform needs to protect that, not something that you have to build, on top of that.
Well, let's get into a specific example there. I mean, again, we want to ensure that the developers are free to code for functionality and not necessarily security. So in this example here with JSON, I mean, hopefully then, assuming that we're using JSON, of course, but I need, which is important too, because you mentioned SQL there as well, XML. So I need multiple, if you will, flavors of threat protection, but we'd like to have this already existing, and it's as easy as drag and drop for a developer to put this in.
Exactly.
And of course, again, back to our flow model here, where I really care about this is on the request flow, inbound, what's hitting my back-end systems. I'm less concerned about my outbound on my response flow, but I'd like that flexibility.
Yes, exactly. And this example here, it's really the different configuration parameters to protect you from a JSON injection attack. And again, this is as simple as configuring it, drag and drop. There's a default parameter. Sometimes you want to tweak it, but it's very simple. You're not thinking about writing a code out there and deploying it in front of an API. Yeah.
Right? My developer actually may not be very fluent, if you will, in JSON. So,
yes.
but the app is using that, and so let's make it easy for him or her.
Right. And so all of the API threats we discussed so far has to be mitigated without really writing code, right? Yeah. And
configuration, not code.
Configuration, and that's going to be a mantra, right?
Yeah.
And you can do that in a way that it meets the API guys as well as apps guys.
Absolutely. Right? And of course, I'm also looking to do that through configuration, not code, for consistency purposes as well.
Exactly. Now, a little bit about so Tim, we talked about the threats so far and the various security capabilities that we can make it available for developers and so forth. But then, let's say we deployed it, everything is beautiful. But now, if I'm a CSO of organization, right?
I want to know that it's beautiful.
Yes, exactly. How do I know, what's happening through my API platform? Yeah. And how do I even detect, is there early warning systems that I can actually leverage? and be able to take something actionable, right?
Yeah. So I'm looking for some security analytics here. What's available to me? And even if the analytics themselves aren't security specific, does not mean that there's no security value in those analytics. In many cases, there are. So in this case, I can start with various operational events, let's say runtime events. Let's go back to the rate limiting. How many transactions per second? How many transactions per minute? And I'd like to be able to put perhaps a temporal window on those to prevent those spikes. I'm thinking availability here. Don't forget about the A in CIA. So I want to start with some of those runtime events, whatever I'm logging there, hopefully. And I'd like to be able to match that against volume, for example, again, spike, arrest, that sort of capability. And I probably want to marry that data with threat data, or more specifically, threat protection data off of all that. So now I'm beginning to get a picture through my analytics of what the security state of my APIs are. And I say APIs, multiple. Mm-hmm. Is it a single API that's having a problem? Is the problem within the API, if you will? Is it against multiple aspects of the API? Is it multiple APIs? Mm-hmm. And frankly, since I have some sort, generally, most large enterprises, most large organizations have some sort of SIM-like capability.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, right?
Absolutely.
Especially, with Splunk and, Sumo Logic and so forth, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So why isn't this a feed into my SIM-like capability? And in fact, this could actually be a queue for my SIM-like capability. Look here, look deeper here, and correlate against whatever other security and or operational sensors that I have. So the point is that while the data may not be security specific, it's still security relevant.
Great.
And therefore, information security people can and should be taking advantage of the analytics from their management platform.
So one thing that is interesting here is that in the past, when we went to the whole web revolution, it was more of an afterthought, because once, for example, the weblogs, right?
There's no need to make that mistake again.
Yeah.
Just build it in.
Yeah. Again, weblogs is an example, right? People are importing it and trying to understand, various patterns. Here, it looks like we have an opportunity to do that in real time and be able to provide the right level of telemetry to the IT architects and the CSOs.
Correct. We've talked about quite a few things here today, Subra. Let's, if you will, recap for our audience here. And I think we've talked quite a bit here about end-to-end security and making sure that your architecture can handle end-to-end, has that capability. We talked about both consumption and exposure. Mm-hmm. Think northbound, southbound, and the importance of that. Certainly DevOps.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and DevOps, again, there is a requirement for them to be more agile, flexible, and be able to meet the security needs of the guys who are thinking about security.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm looking for that consistency from a security perspective. And again, really all of this has to scale. I mean, if I'm going to do this right, I've got to scale. And therefore, I need that platform to help me scale, help me manage all those APIs.
Right. And again, to that point, everything has to be an API, right? and this is where developers really, they love the fact that they can automate the heck out of, end to end.
Well, and as we move towards the so-called Internet of Things, and we have computing devices everywhere these days and sensors everywhere, this becomes all the more important. APIs are just exploding. Okay, more information. We do have more information available. There's an ebook on this, and there's plenty of documentation on the Apigee website as well. So, Subra, I think we're ready for questions from the audience.
And folks, we'll be making the slides available pretty soon, so all the links should be in the slides.
Yep, the links are, and again, the video of the presentation will be on the YouTube channel, the Apigee channel on YouTube, and the slides themselves will be on slideshare.net. So all of this will be available. Subra, do you want to take a question here from Ellen about recommendations for calling API from JavaScript, where OAuth keys secrets are visible in source?
Right. So this is where I think you have to, so as you know, that OAuth comes in different flavors. You got the authorization code, implicit grant, credential grant, right? So in this case, you cannot use the auth code because it's visible to the client itself. You have to use the implicit grant, and it stays, so you get the authentication after you pass the first phase of handshake. You get the token right back. You don't wait for authorization code. Mm-hmm. And this is a common pattern that is used out there for whether it's HTML5 or HTML, JavaScript.
Okay. And Kurt asks a question here: is there an ability to encrypt data such that only apps with specific certificates have the ability to decrypt? So first of all, we need to break that question, because it's really two questions here that he's implying. So we have data in transit, of course, and the encryption on that, generally done using TLS. That will encrypt the data inside the pipe, but that's only as it flows through the pipe. I suspect that Kurt's question is also asking about the data. Can it be encrypted inside of that pipe? And the answer is yes, it could. You can do that either through XML or through a third-party package. If he's talking about specific certificates, he may be hinting at certificate pinning, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so if the question is it based, can we do role-based access based on certificate? Only apps with specific certificates have the ability to decrypt the data. Oh, so the apps. Oh, absolutely. On the apps. Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely on that. So
makes sense.
Yep. Okay. Can Apigee call into our in-house systems to establish end user identity? Mike asked that question. I think he's referring to three-legged OAuth here.
I think maybe it's a delegated authentication. So, for example, if you already have an identity store and you have your, exposed through LDAP or other, SAML identity provider, yes, of course, we can do a callback into, any third-party service for that matter. We have integration with Facebook authentication as an example. So we can tunnel into the IP, based on the provider's information. We can connect to that identity provider, perform the authentication, and then and then again translate that into a token and do the OAuth handshake with the application itself.
So Mike asked a question here. This is right up your alley, Subra. We have, looks like, legacy and custom IDM, identity management, as well as that we would like to integrate into. So can we have the ability to do that?
Yeah, sure. So we did talk about the runtime, where every request comes in can be parsed. So we can take everything in your header, in your parameters, in your payload, right? And we have the ability to parameterize that and be able to call back into any of the entities. It could be your proprietary system, legacy, and all that can be done through Java, JavaScript, Python. And then once authentication is done, we can then bring the state back into the platform.
And we have a short question here asking, what is TLS? TLS is Transport Layer Security, which is, if you will, the follow-on to SSL. So it's just, if you will, a newer version of SSL, and then I should say a more secure version than SSL, which is...
TLS 1.2 is what people should be running.
Yeah. You have not talked about tokenization yet, and support for tokenization by Apigee. So... tokenization.
Yes, so we do have that in our roadmap. So just for folks, who just to make sure we clarify the terminology tokenization, and most of the times it is used in the PCI DSS type applications where credit card data or other sensitive data should be tokenized before it hits the platform, your backend perhaps. And especially it's important when you're sending the data to a third party, right? So today, we can be done through, we call the callouts, the Java custom callouts or Python. Again, like I said, anything coming through our platform can be extracted and manipulated. And we have a feature called key value store, right? And we can actually do the mapping ourselves and be able to do that. But we do plan to, have this feature in a roadmap where you can do that by simply doing a drag and drop of policy and setting up what elements within the XML payload could be tokenized.
We have Hans asked a question about, looks like rate limits here. In your experience, do you think it will affect new API deployment if we start setting limits on calls to protect the API against possible breaches? And so I would say that I'm not sure, it sounds more like from a business perspective, you may want to set quotas on your API, the number of calls that can be made. Again, if you do, that's fine, often obviously for monetization purposes. but you want some sort of temporal window that you can work with. That may be a fixed period, for example, from 11 to 12 o'clock. It may be a sliding window where it's an hour period, but that window slides along with that. So really, if you're going to do that, you're looking for multiple capabilities and being able to do that. And the same thing for rate limiting, same thing, quotas perhaps as well.
Right, and I think the other aspect here is that with security analytics, you can perhaps look at the number of API calls being made, and you can use it as a baseline,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And then use that as feedback into the policy.
Absolutely, absolutely as well. So, I mean, again, take those analytics, which may be operational purposes, and that has or may have security relevance, but don't just dismiss those out of that. We have several other questions, but they are specific to Apigee and Apigee products. And actually, I think I would say go to the website, please, and check it out there. We should probably stay a little more agnostic than getting into product specifications here. So with that said, I see several questions, but again, quite a bit. Can you say how you protect the API from distributed denial of service?
Yeah.
Distributed denial of service is a tough animal anyway, whether it's through APIs or whether it's whether it's against your website, for example. I would say that, again, let's look at the threat protection capabilities that are available. Let's look at the rate limiting that's available. Let's look at the possibly IP address restrictions are relevant. Don't have too many customers in Syria, so I probably don't want anything there. Same with North Korea, and that may be an issue for ITAR purposes as well. But trying to protect against distributed denial of service, if the calls are clean, if you will be tough, but that's where your analytics can help you out. Am I seeing large numbers of the same API call, for example, originate from a certain set of IP addresses? So
certain locations.
Are certain locations, whatever. But anyway, what I believe is really talking about here is not necessarily although it may be the case of the volume itself, but what are my analytics? How good are my analytics? How much breadth do they provide? Are they timely enough that I may be able to detect a distributed denial of service in near real time?
Right, and again, it all depends on the architecture, right? Certainly, if you're doing it in a cloud-based architecture, it has to be distributed. If, for example, Amazon has different regions.
Correct.
Right, so you certainly want to be, don't want all the eggs in one basket.
Yep. So multiple regions, multiple availability zones. Right. Absolutely.
And if you're using a CDN, right? So in some cases, you could cache data and protect that way.
Yep. Akamai's recent acquisition of Prolexic, for example. Well, with that said, Subra, I think we should probably go ahead and close out. So again, would like to thank the audience for joining us today. And again, the video will be available on YouTube channel, and the slides will be available on slideshare.net. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, guys.